Hey guys, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truth or Ministry. In today's video, I am continuing to cover the burial mounds found across Minnesota, and I am talking specifically about looking for the remains of giants and the burial mounds in the state of Minnesota. So, this video is the second video in this series. If you haven't watched my first video, Hunting After Giants in Minnesota, when I went to Indian Mound Regional Park in St. Paul, Minnesota. You might want to go back and watch that one. But in today's video, I have more footage that I captured, and I went to Dayton, Minnesota, and looked at some of the locations for burial mounds found there. I went to Mendota Height, and I looked at the burial mounds found in that region. And then I also went to the city of Mound, Minnesota, and did some digging there. And so that's going to be the footage that I'm showing in this video today. And the main emphasis that I want to hammer home in this video is that these mounds are very, very old. That even though they were considered sacred by various Native American tribes, such as the Dakota peoples or the Ojibwe peoples that lived in Minnesota, these mounds are much, much older than the tribes that use them for their own ceremonies and rituals. Even if you go onto the city website of Mound, Minnesota, one of the places I went to, they attribute and date these mounds as far back as 300 BC to 100 AD. So these mounds are dated to be about 2,000 years old. And then when you go on to other websites such as various Minnesota Historical Society websites, they attribute these mounds back about 2,000 years. So these mounds, although they were sacred to various people such as the Dakotas and the Ojibwe, these mounds are far older than those tribes. They predate them. And what we're really trying to establish is that these mounds across North America, when people have dug into them, in many of these mounds, not necessarily all of them, there have been the remains of giants found in these mounds, and many credible researchers believe that the giants were builders of many of these mounds, and then various Native American tribes later in history found them, understood that there was spiritual significance surrounding these mounds, and then adapted them to their own rituals and ceremonies. And that's in line with what goes on with megalithic sites all over the world. If people who have not looked into the idea of megalithic sites, that, for example, many of the ruins that are found down in places like Peru, in Sacsayhuamana or Cusco, Peru, these megaliths are from a civilization far older than the Incas. But then when you move forward in history, the Incas, they found these ruins and they would build on top of them or they would adapt them for their own purposes. The same thing goes on with the ruins we find in ancient Egypt, where some of these megalithic structures, such as the pyramids, predate the Egyptians, but then they were later adapted by the civilizations that found them. Much of this is rejected by mainstream archaeology, but when you really get into the history of that, that is in fact the case. And that is also true for these mounds. So I'm going to start here I want to read a passage of scripture that's pretty interesting in regards to the giants. This is Numbers 13:33. This is speaking about when Joshua and Caleb and the spies of Israel went to spy out the land. And these Israeli scouts said, "And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sights." So the Israelites that scouted out the land of Canaan, they saw these tribes. And they saw that these tribes had within them giants. Some of these tribes were tribes of giants among the Canaanite nations, and that they described themselves as being as grasshoppers in the sight of these giants. And some commentators have tried to get around this by simply explaining this away, saying they were afraid, they were exaggerating, they were not describing literal giants, they were simply blowing things out of proportion. But if you simply read the text of Scripture as it is, it's very clear that the Israelites did encounter tribes of giants when they entered into the promised land of Canaan. Now, the question is, what happened to these giants once the Israelites went in there and they completed the conquest of Canaan, of Israel? And obviously that took time. Joshua completed much of it, and then later on you get into the period of Judges. But these giants got pushed out of the land of Canaan, and many of them took to the seas of the Mediterranean. We know that various civilizations, such as the Phoenicians, which were the greatest of the ancient seafaring peoples, they were from that same region of Canaan. And we know that these giants, they went to various places such as Sardinia, where we see megalithic ruins found there. We know that the Phoenicians founded places like the colony of Carthage in North Africa, which later became famous in history for its role in the Punic Wars against the Romans. But then some of these seafaring peoples from Canaan went across the Mediterranean Sea. They crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, which the Greeks called the Pillars of Hercules, and then they went out into the Great Sea that we know as the Atlantic Ocean. And many researchers of the giants believe that that is how they found their way to North America. Now, were there other giants before the the um, the giants that fled out from Canaan? Possibly, maybe, maybe not. But really, we really believe that because of them being scattered from Canaan, that is the most likely reason why they found their way to other parts of the world. Now, much of this history is still being studied by biblical researchers, by archaeologists. There's been so many researchers in recent times that have really got into this subject of the giants. But we know that these giants were the builders of these mounds, and that when in many of these mounds, when they've been dug up, there have been the remains of giants found within them. Now, in some of these burial sites, there'll be, when they've been unearthed, there have been skeletons of later Native Americans found alongside the skeletons of a giant, which lines up with that idea of later civilizations adapting ruins that they find for their own purposes. So all that to say, when we get into all that history, we see that these mounds are very, very old. They're 2,000 years old, and that they predate the ones in Minnesota that I'm going to show footage of. They predate the Dakota and the Ojibwe tribes that they're often attributed to, and they were sacred to those people, but they predate them. And that many of these mounds, when they've been unearthed, they have had the remains, the skeletons of giants found within them. The reason why this isn't more public knowledge than it is because it has been covered up by various institutions such as the Smithsonian Institute in North America. The Vatican has played a large central role in the cover up of giants across the world, and especially in places such as Sardinia. And there's much more history that could be said. I'm going to read one last section of here from MinnesotaHistory.net about the mounds in Mound, Minnesota, the city that's named because it was settled in an area of these mounds. And this is from MinnesotaHistory.net because Mound, Minnesota is one of the places that I went to. And this says, it is no surprise that there are burial mounds in Hennepin County community called Mound, which was actually named for that feature as there are in many places around Lake Minnetonka. So in other words, all around Lake Minnetonka, which was a place that was settled by various Native American tribes, such as the Dakotas, until the white settlers came, there were all these burial mounds. But then when the city of Mound was settled, they found these mounds. Some of these mounds were located in the very territory which was later became within the city limits of Mound, Minnesota. Now, continuing on to read, the lake was an ancient occupation site for the Dakota and other groups, though European Americans did not know of the place until the 1820s or 30s, 150 years after their arrival in the Minnesota region. Why is it then a surprise to landowners today that there are no mounds at Mound? So then it continues to talk about this. And then another section it says, here's what Warren Uppen says in his classic book, Minnesota Geographic Names, first published in 1920. Mound, a city on or near the northwestern shore of Lake Minnetonka. This city is named for its aboriginal mounds. 3 groups of mound within the area village mapped by Newton H. Winchell have respectively 4, 18, and 9 mounds, and at a distance of about a mile westward is a remarkable series of 69 mounds on the north side of Halstead's Bay. So we see that this is well recorded history that there were mounds in these various regions of North Dakota. Now, obviously, the mainstream history that's not going to talk about its connections to giants, but when you do other digging into other things from other sources, you get into all those old newspaper articles from the 1800s when these mounds were being dug into and unearthed across North America in the United States. We know that these mounds do have a connection to the giant. So I could say a lot more on that, but I'm going to proceed now to show the footage that I took in Dayton, Minnesota, in Mendota Heights, and then also around Mound, Minnesota. So God bless, guys.
Hey guys, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. So here I am today in Dayton, Minnesota, looking for more burial mounds, and I'm at the new Schwaden Memorial Dakota burial site. So this is an area where I've been told that there are more mounds. This sign here behind me, it talks about the Dakota burial mounds in this area. So I'm going to do a little bit of investigating. I'm going to look around. I'm going to see what we can find. But this is an area where we know that there are more mounds located. So here in this picture, we have the sign that I'm talking about from this memorial here in Dayton, Minnesota, the new Schwaden Memorial. And what's really helpful about this sign is that it explicitly says that these mounds predate the Dakota peoples. If you read the top paragraph of the sign, it says, "The land always has a story to tell. On these lands, now part of Elm Creek Park Reserve, lie the footprints of many old stories. Some pre-Dakota peoples left only burial mounds behind to mark their existence," and it gives these names of these groups. The Winnebagos, the Ho-Chunk Nation left even less evidence of themselves. So what we're trying to point out here is that these mounds predate the Dakota peoples, even though they were sacred to the Dakotas, and these sites were later used by the people such as the Dakota, but that these mounds are far older. Like I said, mainstream historians would say that these go back between 300 BC to 100 AD, give or take. So in front of me here, I have what appears to be potentially a burial mound, and as I'm doing a panorama, this entire area is supposed to be an area where Dakota burial mounds, as they're described by mainstream historians, are located. So this entire area here has these mounds, and if you look closely in front of me, some of this is, it's covered with a lot of plants and sediment and what have you, but you clearly have this very clear mound structure, and that's kind of what we're looking for. Where, like I said before in my last video, some of these mounds may have nothing to do with giants at all, but many of them have been, when they've been unearthed, they have had the remains of giant skeletons. So that's really what we're looking for. So I'm just taking another panorama here of this area as I'm walking around and doing a little exploring. It always amazes me how an area like this, a place that has historic burial mounds, can be located very close to a suburban area. I'm only about 20 minutes northwest of Minneapolis, kind of on the outskirts of the suburbs, and it really shows how when the white settlers came and settled this area of Minnesota, they came up and discovered these mounds that are extremely old. And a lot of them, according to mainstream historians and archaeologists, they were sacred to the Dakota, but they're much older than the Dakota or the Ojibwe tribes that lived in Minnesota. According to their estimates, they go back as far as 300 BC to 100 AD. So it just gives you some idea of what we're looking at here. This is a really beautiful area here. I'm going to march around a little bit more. So I'm looking at another large hill here, and some of these hills, you got to wonder, are they simply hills, or are these in fact the burial mounds being spoken of? Because you just see that this area with these hills, it really gets you thinking about what are we actually looking at here, and then that brings the second question: what could be located underneath these mounds? So I'm in Mendota Heights, Minnesota. I am at Pilot Knob Indian Burial Ground. So looking for more mounds. I was really interested. I found this sign here, and even though you can't see the text on it, it literally says that this site is designated as a historically significant site by the U.S. Department of the Interior. So I don't know what that's going to mean, what that's not going to mean, but that makes me excited that maybe I'm going to find something pretty interesting here. So let's go find out what there is. Here's a panorama of this Dakota burial area in Mendota Heights. It's amazing. Look at this. You got the highway, you got the city skyline, and then right next to it, Dakota burial mounds. It's just like history and the modern clashing together. It's just really something to see. So we'll see if we can find any mounds here. So here you get pretty good panorama of this burial site. With all this brush that's grown over all this, it's hard to make out where there may be mounds, what's just hills. I mean, as I've walked around this place, it's really overgrown with all of this brush, so it makes it somewhat difficult, but obviously still a historic site where even on the plaques you read, there's mention of these mounds. So that's pretty interesting. So in this picture, you see that there's a sign here of describing, it gives a little description of how these tribes gathered along the mouth of the Minnesota River, and the Dakota tribes, the Ojibwe and the Iowa, that this place here was a place for ceremonies and burials, and that's all laid out. So this just gives us more confirmation, more information of what we're looking at here in regards to this burial site, that it was a sacred place to the Dakota and Ojibwe peoples. So I was on my way out from the Dakota Indian burial mounds, and I saw that there's this modern day cemetery right next to it. I guess what you'd call a Christian cemetery. And there's a statue here with these three figures, and if you look close, there is a Masonic square and compass on the statue. And you look at these three philosopher, stone builder type figures, and there's a giant globe above them. And I was thinking to myself, wow, you can't make that up, the stuff I've been talking about. But yeah, that's just really interesting. And obviously I could exaggerate that and make it more than it is, but literally these stonemasons with a globe above them and a Masonic square and compass. So it's a Masonic statue, and man, I just thought that was really interesting. So here I am, I'm standing on the shores of Lake Minnetonka on the outskirts of the city named Mound, Minnesota. And as you can tell, the name Mound, Minnesota, it has its name for a reason. It's named after these mounds that are located across the state of Minnesota, and they were actually located in the area of within the city limits when Mound, Minnesota was originally established. So that's pretty interesting. I'm going to take a walk around downtown. I'm not expecting to find too much in regards to mounds, but we'll see. They do have a Lake Minnetonka History Center. This entire area around Lake Minnetonka, before the white settlers came and settled in this area, various Native American tribes, they lived around this lake, and they were located close to these burial mounds. So just more of that history. We're just discovering, we're looking around, we're exploring, and we're finding some exciting stuff. So we'll see what we find within the city limits of Mound, Minnesota, and we'll go from there. So I went into the Lake Minnetonka Historical Society, and what I found there was essentially a wealth of information. There was a gentleman there who was willing to talk to me for a few minutes about the mounds, and he showed me a map in a computer with some of the various locations around Lake Minnetonka, even though he told me that they do not disclose the specific locations of the site just because they want these sites to be respected. And I understood that, and he was really kind about it. But I was able to ask him a few brief questions. But they had a PDF that I was able to download on my phone with a QR code that I'm able to show here. They had a specific map in the PDF with all the sites that I was able to download onto my computer. And then they had a computer section with an interactive click and point pointing to various sites. All this information was extremely helpful. And I was able to, if you look here at this picture, you see at the northwest quadrant of what's called Halstead Bay on the western edge of Lake Minnetonka, there was a site, and I was able to drive my car pretty much to this exact site on my phone, and I was able to videotape some mound-like hills here that appear to be potentially the mounds that were pointed to on this map, because of the fact that they are in pretty much the exact same location that was shown on the map. So I'll show this footage next, but I'll leave all this to the judgment of the viewers. So I'm standing here close to the northwest side of Halstead Bay on Lake Minnetonka, and I saw these two hills here, which they're very large, but they look like they could be elongated, long, snake-like mounds. And so I wanted to just take a minute and record them. I was told by a gentleman in the Lake Minnetonka Historical Society that there is some mounds still located in this area around the bay of Lake Minnetonka. So I've just been driving around exploring, and I stopped here just because I noticed that this particular hill in front of me really was shaped like a mound. So I'm at Carver Park Reserve close to Lake Minnetonka, finishing up my day today. I feel like once again we made some good progress today. I think seeing some of those mounds in Dayton and hiking around and looking around there was helpful. And I feel like going to Lake Minnetonka and driving around the lake has been helpful. I walked into the Lake Minnetonka Historical Society. That was helpful, the information I found there. And essentially what I'm doing, guys, is I'm visiting all these places for myself, because I just think there's something different about finding something, going there, looking at it with your own eyes. You can read stuff on the internet all day, but it's just different to go and see things with your own eyes. And when you see these mounds, or if you're not aware of the mounds, it might not seem like much, but when you start to see them with your own eyes and confirm that they're real, and you start to read these historical records, and then you put that together with this other information about how these mounds have excavated giants in the future, it just starts to bring it more and more out of the realm of, quote, conspiracy, and it brings it into the realm of history and reality. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to generate interest for people to look into this. We're trying to show that, no, there's real landmarks around Minnesota that have this stuff. We're trying to show that this is real. I mean, obviously, to find a real giant skeleton, you would have to start literally digging into these mounds, and that's a whole other thing. So that level, extra level of archaeology, that's something that would have to be a more down the road type project. But I'm just trying to go around, document what I see, and show what is really going on with these mounds, and talk about it and explain it to people. And once again, I think we had another successful day today. I think we're making more and more progress, and I'm looking forward to going up to International Falls soon and documenting what I find up there, and then we'll go from there. One of the things that's really struck me as I've been going around to these different places, so many people I know, they don't even know these mounds exist. They've never been told about them. They've never even heard of them. And when you go to these places, you get these little plaques, and it's so easy to just walk by them, to pass them by. And some people, even if they do know about them, they don't realize. They would go, oh, Indian burial mounds, okay. But so even the people who do know about them, they don't realize there could be potentially huge historical significance to what these mounds are. So some of the things I've looked at in my video, or I've talked about in my video today. So for example, how these mounds, even the mainstream historians, mainstream archaeologists say, these mounds are far older than the Dakota peoples or the Ojibwe peoples who lived in Minnesota. Yeah, they were sacred to those tribes of Native Americans. They were used. The Native Americans would do rituals and sometimes even bury their own dead in these same areas. But these mounds predate them. That's what's significant. And so it's so easy to, on the first hand, not even know these mounds exist. Number two, not know any of the history of them. And then three, certainly not know the significance of these mounds. So that's why we're trying to piece all this together today. And we're trying to paint a picture that, hey, look, these things are real. They exist. There's landmarks around them. And then number two, there's more to the story than meets the eye. So I'm gonna keep digging. You guys can stay tuned for my next video coming up soon in regards to this topic. I'm hoping to go up all the way up to International Falls and do more exploring there, but we've already found a few different sites in Minnesota burial mounds, and we're going to keep trying to find more information tying these things to the remains of giants. So that being said, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truth and Ministry. God bless.